begin, we'll turn to Psalm 46. Psalm 46. We'll read verse 10. And God is speaking, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth." Again, the Psalms were written as songs. They are poetic literature. This particular psalm consists of 3 stanzas, marked by the word Selah, verse 3, verse 7, verse 11. Again, that's simply a musical pause, a place for the singing and the instruments to stop so that those involved could take in what had been sung. In the first stanza, which would be verses 1 through 3, you have the sufficiency of God is set forth. The fact that He is our stability. And then you come to Selah. That is, take it in, let it become a part of you. In the second stanza, verses 4 through 7, the security of God is set forth. The fact that He is our comfort and everything we need. And then you come to Selah. Again, take it in, let it become a part of you. In the third stanza, which would be verse 8, verse 9, verse 11, verse 10 is an interruption. The fact is set forth that He is our deliverance. He's our victory. And then you come to Selah. So 3 times, Selah. And that is indicative of the depth of meaning in the psalm. That it was necessary to pause, to think about what had been sung. Again, 3 times, Selah. In the case of literature, which is what we have reading it, it's a place for the reader to stop and to contemplate what has been said. It's a place for reflection. Throughout the psalm, with the exception of verse 10, the psalmist, again, is speaking of the Lord. But then verse 10 comes an interruption to the flow of the psalm. It is a God interruption. A God interruption. And God speaks. And as we said earlier, this is the climax of the psalm. It is the instruction. It is the exhortation. It is the application of the psalm. It's the lesson of the psalm. And it is the lesson that all need. Be still and know that I'm God. Our subject is knowing God through stillness. Knowing God through stillness. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. Again, we made mention earlier of the psalm. Appears that the psalmist is in a very healthy spiritual condition. So we want to consider the spiritual condition of the psalmist as he writes. Again, the 46th Psalm is an expression. It's an overflow of praise to God. It is a song of praise to God. It is the expression and the overflow of faith and adoration and reverence for God. What we read here in the 46th Psalm is a heart that is assured and confident in God. It is a heart in a state of worship. Reading the psalm, we see that it begins with God. God is. Throughout the psalm, verse 5, again we come to God is. And in verse 7 and verse 11, we read the Lord of hosts is, and you also read the God of Jacob is. So 6 times it is emphatically declared by the psalmist that He is, that God is. And this is so regardless of what happened. It is so regardless of what is happening. It is so regardless of what may happen. God is. And this becomes the focus and the theme of the psalm, which leads to the lesson of the psalm, be still and know that I am God. In verses 2 and 3, there are 4 images marked by the word though. You see that word though 4 times. Simply meaning regardless of the fact, or however, or nevertheless. And these 4 images speak of great upheaval and great disturbance, conveying the idea of disruption, turbulence, chaos. The images presented in verses 2 and 3 is that which is most firm, that which is solid, that which is stable being brought to ruin. Things that you knew would always be there suddenly aren't. The images presented in verses 2 and 3 is, again, ruin. And though these things be so, you come to verse 4 and 5. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God. In spite of verses 2 and 3, there is a river in the midst of all of this. And then he mentions the Most High. The Most High. So, and then he says in verse 5, God is in the midst. So, the psalm, the focus is God. In verse 6, you have the heathen. They're in a state of rage. They're in a state of agitation. But then you come to verses 7 through 9. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. And we see as you read on that there's all kinds of problems. There's the mention of crisis and disaster and calamity and dire straits, chaos, the rage of the heathen again. But that's not the focus. None of these things are the focus. In fact, the psalmist does not start with these things. The psalmist starts with, God is. And that's where we're always to start. You don't start with the problem. You start with God. God is. God is. So, reading the psalm, the psalmist is taken with the fact of God. And this gripped his heart. He is aware of God. His life has been impacted by God. God is reality to him. In reading the 46th Psalm, the psalmist is reflecting upon God. It has much to do with our health, our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. What is it that we reflect upon? What is it that we think about? So the psalmist, as you read this, he's not being shaped. He's not being cast into the mold of circumstances. But his thought process in life is being shaped by God is. God is. Hear him declare in verse 4 that he's the Most High. That is, there's nothing equivalent to God. He's nothing higher ranking than God. He is aware that God is more than whatever may be on the other side of those in verses 2 and 3. In verse 6, he mentions the power of God's voice. He says, He uttered His voice, and the earth melted. In verse 7 and verse 11, there's the personal recognition that God, who is the Most High, He is also the Lord of hosts. That is, he's recognizing God has all authority. God has everything under control, and God reigns supreme. And again, this is so regardless of what is connected with though in verses 2 and 3. Nothing can shake His reign. Nothing. The psalmist is also aware, verse 7 and 11, that the God who is the Most High, the God who is the Lord of hosts, is also the God of Jacob, the God of patience, the God of long-suffering, the God of compassion, the one who can overhaul and transform lives. He's the God of transforming power. The psalmist is in a spiritual condition that causes him to be aware of these things. He's in a spiritual condition that causes him to be aware that God is active, that God is working. He's in a spiritual condition that recognizes the hand of God. In verse 5 he says, God shall. That is confidence in the faithfulness of God. He's in a spiritual condition that gives him confidence that God will be faithful. It is a confident dependence upon God. In verse 6, He uttered His voice. In verse 8, He mentions the works of the Lord. Also in verse 8, He hath made. And verse 9, He maketh, He breaketh, and cutteth, and burneth. So the psalmist is in a spiritual condition that causes him to see God working, causes him to see God's hand. He's in such a spiritual condition that he can see that God is relevant to his life. This is manifested in the use of personal pronouns in relation and connection to God. You have the word our, verse 1, verse 7, verse 11. And you have the word we in verse 2, and her and she in verse 5, and us in verse 7 and 11. The psalmist is in a spiritual condition that causes him to realize God's presence. This is a good place to be. It is a healthy spiritual condition. And verse 1, verse 7, verse 11, this God who is the Most High, this God who is the Lord of hosts and the God of Jacob, He's present with us. Notice verse 1, God is very or exceedingly and truly present. And the psalmist is aware of the Lord's presence as our refuge, our strength, and our help. In verse 5, it is God is in the midst. Again, speaking of His presence. In verse 7 and verse 11, the Lord of hosts is with us. So, reading through this psalm, the psalmist appears to be in a very good spiritual place. He's in a healthy spiritual condition, with his heart and mind set upon God. That's the only way we can be in a good spiritual condition, is the heart and mind set upon God. So reading the psalm, the psalmist appears, no reason to question it, he appears to be living with faith in God concerning all the happenings of life. He appears to be enjoying God. He appears to be refreshed by God. And then God speaks to this man who is in a healthy state. Be still and know that I am God. That is a call from God to us. But considering the spiritual condition of the psalmist, it is a call, regardless of your spiritual condition, that all need to continually hear. Be still and know that I'm God. You would think that someone who's in such a spiritual state, as the psalmist appears to be, that God would not have to say to him, be still and know that I am God. But that's who he's speaking to. He's speaking to the psalmist. He is telling him what we all need to hear. Again, the psalmist has been talking of God. So we can view this also as a warning to us. Not saying this was the case with the psalmist. I believe the psalmist was in a good spiritual state. But you and I can be. We can talk of God without Him really having our attention. And we need to always be aware of that. We can talk of God and Him not have our attention. And if we are in a good spiritual state, as it appears the psalmist was, we still need to hear. Be still. Why? Because we can be more still. And know. Because we can know more. You see, there's still more. Even if we're in a spiritually healthy state, we need to hear these words. Be still and know that I am God. And one of the reasons is because it will not take much to upset our stillness. We are very prone to be diverted from our stillness. So let's look at this call from God to us. Though the psalmist is focused upon God, God still directs his attention to himself. It's as if God is saying, keep paying attention to me. Stay still and be knowing that I am God. It is God further directing the attention of the psalmist to himself. We can have our attention upon God, but because of who and what we are, our attention needs to be even further directed to God. It is a call for the psalmist. Though the psalmist has taken notice of God, it is a call for him to take further notice of God. And we may be taking notice of God. And here comes this reminder, take further notice. In other words, it's an ongoing need. It never stops. Be still and know that I'm God. You look back on your life since you've been saved, and the best times of your life have been those times when you were still in the presence of God. Those have been the best times, spiritually, of your life. These words, be still and know that I'm God, they can come in the form of a whisper. They can also come and be a reverberating voice. But regardless, we need to hear them. Be still and know that I'm God. Hopefully all God has to do is whisper. Be still and know that I'm God. But regardless, whether it's a whisper or a voice that shakes everything around us, we need to hear those words. And we need to hear them in such an impactful way that it affects our entire being. Be still. Be still. And know that I am God. In the midst of the constant movement all around us, in the midst of all the clamor and the anxiety, oh, how we need this reminder. Be still. Be still. But it is be still and in addition to being still, know. Be still and know. To know is to recognize something. It is to be aware of something. It can have reference, the word know can have reference to a state of confidence, a state of persuasion and certainty. Be still and know that I am God. Recognize that I am God. Be aware that I am God. He says, know that. Again, to know must have an object. You have to know something. So it has to have an object. Be still and know that. God's directing us to something very specific. This is the object of knowing. Be still and know that. Be still and know that. And then comes a God declaration. It's the object of what we know. I am God. I am God. We need to be reminded of that all the time. I am God. It's an all-inclusive statement. There are no words more significant than God saying, I am God. There are no words more relevant and consequential to your life than God saying, I am God. God is saying this by way of instructive reminder. I am God. So it's instruction, but it's also a reminder. We need to be reminded over and over, I am God. Every time we think we have to take matters into our own hands, we need to be reminded, I am God. I am God. In times of anxiety and stress, we need to be reminded, I am God. I am God. It's an instructive reminder to recognize and be aware. I am God. It is an instructive reminder to be confident, to be persuaded, to be certain, absolutely assured. I am God. Be still and know that I am God. That is a call to faith. That is a call to believe. Believe what? I am God. I am God. That's what we need to believe. I am God. It is a call to embrace the fact He is God. Embrace that. Hold on to that. Be still and know that I am God. It is a call to a central focus. And we preach on this all the time. Focus. I am God. He is making a personal statement about Himself. I am God. He is telling us something of His identity. Who am I? I am God. He is telling us something of His character. I am God. He is telling us something of His function and His work as it relates to man. I am God. Be still and know that I am. And just stop right there. Know that whatever follows, I am, is absolute. It is certain. It is emphatic. Hear Him say, I am, and know that what follows is exclusive to Him and is unconditional. Hear Him say, I am, and know what follows covers all time and goes beyond time. Hear Him say, I am, and know that what follows is fathomless. It's perpetual. It's infinite. It's everlasting. And what follows, I am here, is God. I am God. And there is no time, there is no place, there is no realm, there is no circumstance when that is not true. I am God. If you could go into the depths of hell, it is still true. I am God. He is God everywhere, all the time. Hear Him say, know that I am God. It is a call to an acute awareness of who He is. This is more than, well, I believe there's a God. No, this is more than that. You can believe there's a God, but do you believe He is God? I am God. What a statement. And that's what our attention is being called to. And again, throughout the psalm, the theme is God is. That's the theme of the psalm. And now we hear God say, I am God. It is a statement inclusive of everything said about Him in this psalm. The psalmist has been speaking about God, declaring the overwhelming fact of God. And now God interrupts it all and says, I am God. I am everything that you've said and more. In the psalm, you have the absolute being of God. And God says, I am. In the psalm, God's sovereignty is brought forth. And God says, I am. He is declaring His sovereignty. In the psalm, His presence is declared. And God says, I am God. I am God. I am present. In the psalm, you have God's providence. That is, God working His purpose and His plan. You read the words, God shall. He uttereth His voice. The works of the Lord He hath made. He maketh, He breaketh, He cutteth, He burneth. In Psalm, in verse 10, I will be. He's no distant spectator with his hands tied by the whims and puny will of man. He says, I'm God. I'm God. In those words, there's reason for you and I to take courage. Do you need reason to be courageous? I am God. There's reason for strength. There's reason for resolve, steadfastness, comfort, gladness. I am God. Well, you know, we could really use some good news around here. What better news is there? God saying, I am God. That's good news. It's true every day. But we lose sight of it. Be still and know that I am God. But there's more. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. I am God, and there's this promise. I will be exalted among the heathen. Well, what if I will be exalted among the heathen? Well, what if such and such happens? I will be exalted. I will be. It's a declaration. He is saying everything's on course. You have verses 2 and 3. Everything's in chaos. But God interrupts it all and says, I'm God. And I will be exalted. So what He's saying is everything is on course. I will be exalted. That's always so. That's always so. So read verse 10 over and over. It needs to pierce through everything that's going on. Whatever it is that's going on, it doesn't matter. Those words need to pierce through everything that's going on and reach our hearts. I am God. That needs to reach our hearts. I am God. He is telling us what we've said many times in the past. Think God. That's what He's saying. Be still and know that I am God. Think God. Think less on Democrats and Republicans. Think God. Think God. Think less on what's going on all around us. Think God. Don't remove God from the setting. Doesn't matter what the setting is. I am God. I am God. Well, it can't get any worse than this. I am God. We need to make personal examination. Where do we begin? Again, as we said earlier, the psalm, there's a lot of trouble in the psalm. But where does it begin? God is. God is. It begins with God. Where does it end? Verse 11. It ends with God. It begins with God. It ends with God. And what is the emphasis between verse 1 and verse 11? It's God. So it begins with God, it ends with God, and everything in between is God. Be still and know that I am God. It cannot be stressed enough. The setting is not the emphasis. Again, God is our refuge. Immediately we picture a storm. But that's not where it begins. It begins with God is. The setting is not, the storm is not the emphasis. God is the emphasis. God is the subject. God is the theme. And may that be so in our life as well. In verse 11, after this God interruption, the psalmist resumes speaking. And as we said in the first message, he repeats what he said in verse 7. But I believe it's more than just a repetition. I believe he does so. I believe he writes verse 11 with even greater assurance and greater exuberance. I believe he wrote verse 7 with great assurance and great excitement. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. But in verse 11, what God said in verse 10 has got a hold of him. It's gripped his heart. And what he writes in verse 11, though it's a repetition, there's more assurance because he's heard from God. There's more exuberance. Our hearts and minds, when this gets a grip on our hearts and minds, be still and know that I am God. I will be. When that gets a grip upon us, we will live our lives with greater assurance, greater exuberance. Oh, did you hear what so-and-so said today? I can't believe it. And that gets a grip on us. And we're upset for the whole day. And days on end. And you turn on the news and you're reminded of it over and over and over and over again. Don't forget what so-and-so said, so you can stay in your state of upsetness. But why don't we just hear what God says? Be still and know that I am God. Yes, so-and-so said such and did such and threatens to do such and such. But God is still God. God is still God. That's what you need to focus on. That's how to be still. So read verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. The way to know God is be still. And the way to be still is to know God. It's very simple. You want to know God? Be still. Be still. You want to be still? Know God. Know God. Know who He is. Not just know that there is a God, not just know there is a higher being, but know that He's God. When someone says, well, I believe in a higher being, you need to ask them, well, who is that? Who is this higher being that you're talking about? Who is it? Who is He? I am God. We need that every day. We need it several times a day. Every time we get upset, we need to hear God saying, be still and know that I am God. Because what we do, when we get upset, when we get disturbed, we carry it on with us through the day, and we're not going to let go of the thing. We're going to carry it in through the next day. And then we find out more information, and now we're even more upset, and on it goes. Wouldn't life be so much easier? Be still and know that I am God. That's what we need. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us.